So, like 6 months ago, I made a video about why the Fiend is the worst character in wrestling, and time has pretty much proven me right on literally everything I said about him. That's not to dunk on Bray Wyatt as a wrestler, it's not to dunk on people who like the character. It's just a matter of the character hasn't really panned out and was never going to pan out because the Fiend doesn't really fit with WWE because supernatural characters don't fit with WWE or wrestling in general. Now, I know what you're all thinking, which is that, well, The Undertaker did it, and as I mentioned in that video, The Undertaker was kind of a one-off, and even The Undertaker didn't really do the supernatural thing forever. People like to forget the fact that he sort of turned into a biker and kind of disavowed all of the supernatural stuff because it was all played out at the end of the Attitude Era. And I mean, he went back to it, but the thing is that WWE doesn't have the attention span to run with a character like that. And The Undertaker was around in the beginning. And because he was around in the beginning, Vince McMahon was willing to go above and beyond for a guy who was always a team player. And simply put, he just doesn't have that kind of mentality for the new talent to come in to his organization anymore. Like, The Undertaker is the only character in all of WWE who's ever lasted as a supernatural menace for any period of time. Because if you look at all the others, doesn't matter if you're Papa Shango, doesn't matter if you're the Boogeyman, doesn't matter if you're Kane. I mean, you don't get the seriousness, the legacy treatment. There's a reason why Kane's never going to get a documentary series about himself. There's a reason why that's never going to happen. Because if you just look about how they were booked, booked differently, all the silly, stupid stuff that Kane got booked in, that The Undertaker didn't, because of the way that Vince McMahon values certain people, the Fiend never had a chance. I mean, the Fiend's writing was on the wall with how many times he's worked with, Randy Orton. The one thing you need to understand about WWE is that it puts all of its characters into categories. So it doesn't really distinguish between them, which is why all, heels end up being cowardly heels no matter who they are, because it doesn't really distinguish between, say, Roman Reigns and Seth Rollins. It doesn't really distinguish between, Sasha Banks and Nia Jax. Because to the writers, these are all the same people. They are individuals to be slotted into a role. They're not characters to be written. And once you understand that, you understand why the Fiend is never going to work. And often, you can see this in real time, which is why Alexa Bliss is getting the Aleister Black treatment, where she's basically in a room talking to herself, which is not a good sign for where the character's going to be going, just going to say that, because that character goes nowhere. That character is what WWE does when they don't know what to do with the character, but they think that they're spooky. So they put them in a room and have them talk nonsense for weeks, and then nothing comes of it because WWE loses interest. That's the same character that Mansoor was in for a while when he was the hacker, I think, and it was the same place where Matt Hardy was in when he was doing the woke gimmick. This is where these characters end up, okay? And it's where Bray Wyatt was when he was still doing his cult member thing. Where he sits in a room and talks to themselves. They sit in a room and they talk to themselves, and they don't say anything important, but that's just WWE's way of saying, hey, these characters don't matter. But they slot into the pre-written thing that WWE have written, because every single person that works for WWE has to fit a mold. Which brings us back to the Fiend, and why he always works with Randy Orton. Because Randy Orton is another character that always fits a mold, and that mold is the other monster that the monster is fighting. See, WWE has this thing about monsters fighting each other, and they don't fight normal people. So that's why they would do things like schedule the Great Khali to work with The Undertaker, or they would schedule like Big Daddy V to work with the Great Khali, or even way back in the day, they would put like Mabel, against some other monster, because the whole idea is that you put these big guys against each other. But the thing is, it's not necessarily that they're big, it's that they fit the same role of monster versus monster, which is a tried and true trope that WWE love. And so, aside from The Fiend and Aleister Black, who's a non-entity in WWE, the only other real monster character that WWE has is Randy Orton. And so the only thing that they can do is put The Fiend versus Randy Orton, which is why I think they fought in 3 WrestleManias now. I think it's 3. They've all been bad. there's the one, yeah, I think it's been 3, because there was the one they did at WrestleMania where they superimposed maggots onto the canvas when he was still, maybe it was only 2. Because there's that, and then there's the House of Horrors. No, it was 3, because it was that one, and it's the House of Horrors match where they fought inside of a kitchen. And then there's this one, or maybe the House of Horrors was Backlash. I really don't remember. They've wrestled way too many times over the years because WWE just slots Randy Orton into the he's a monster category because he's insane. And that's really all the thinking that they've done for the character. Because Randy Orton has worked for the company so long that he's sort of become the stand-in monster figure. Because Vince McMahon doesn't trust anybody who's younger than 40, essentially, to, work these big type matches. And so the Fiend, who's a supernatural type character, like a monster type character, really can only work certain individuals. John Cena is no longer with the company, so they already worked that match. And he was the other guy who fought all the monsters, because you were considered a monster. If you slotted into that role, you were fighting John Cena at some point. And he was going to bury you. Not because necessarily he had the shovel out, although he did plenty of times, but because that's just the way WWE slotted people in. WWE slotted people into the role of you're a monster, you fight John Cena. And so really, the Fiend doesn't have anybody left except for Bray Wyatt, or except for Randy Orton, which is why Randy Orton feuded with Alexa Bliss, because they literally have no one else. And there's no one else to really make it work, because Edge is now too old and broken down, so much as I hate to say that. He's way too old and broken down to do the, extreme hardcore matches, and even if they could do them, they wouldn't. The Fiend character would have worked if it was 20 years ago, and they were still doing hardcore matches. And not necessarily that anyone wants to see hardcore matches, but the Fiend character of this unstoppable monster is basically Mankind. That's what WWE would cast him as. That's what they've tried to cast him as when they're writing, oh, he was burned alive, and oh, he came back from the dead. These are Mankind Cactus Jack tropes. These are the same tropes they trotted out for 30 years ago, 20, 30 years ago when they were doing this. And the Fiend just doesn't work. The Fiend can't work because WWE doesn't commit to the bit of him being supernatural. It doesn't commit to the bit of him being a big deal. And because WWE is almost comedically wedded to the idea of you fit a role, you are not a character, you're a person who we slot into this role, and if you fit, great, and if you don't, it's too bad. Because they're committed to that, there's no one else to fight the Fiend. There's nobody else. Because I don't know, again, I don't know if Bray Wyatt has, pull or something, or if Bray Wyatt has a monkey's paw, or if he's just, if he has the devil's luck, because he's avoided disaster 3 times now. Okay? Remember when they were going to reveal Sister Abigail, that he was Sister Abigail in drag that one time, and the only reason that they didn't do that match was because he got sick and so he couldn't perform, and so they just scrapped the match and they never mentioned it again? Yeah, they were going to do that because they have no idea what to do with him. And then he basically got destroyed by John Cena, and then Randy Orton, because of course he did, because he's a monster and that's where he slots in. And he was basically dead on arrival. And then he reinvented the Firefly Funhouse, Firefly Funhouse gimmick. He reinvented that. And it was good as a vignette, but it has the problem of okay, what makes me want, like, what makes this, why is this guy wrestling? Like, okay, you can make vignettes of a character. That doesn't mean he works as a wrestler. He works as a Chikara wrestler, maybe. He doesn't work as a WWE wrestler. Because there's no reason for him to wrestle in the WWE. Because the WWE likes to pretend it's all about, sports and athleticism, and it doesn't work at all when you have a character who doesn't care about any of that. At all. So, the entire concept of the Fiend doesn't work because the mythology of the Fiend doesn't fit WWE, and WWE is not going to be interested in creating a unique mythology for the Fiend. They're just going to slot him into the, monster role. And because the monster role no longer fights guys like Roman Reigns, he has nowhere to go. He has Randy Orton, and that's it. And Alexa Bliss is also dead on arrival because Alexa Bliss has gone from the staple of the division to her getting hurt and still them building essentially the division around her to being stuck with the Fiend in a dead-end gimmick that's never going to, pay off. Because WWE isn't capable of writing the distinction between childish and childlike. That's why characters like, God, what's the guy's name? I'm blanking on the dude's name. 1 minute. Matt Riddle. That's the guy's name I'm thinking of. I just remember him as the guy who walks around like a stoner and says bro all the time. Because he's essentially a caricature of 2000 stoner bro because he fits the role. He's basically in the same role Rob Van Dam was in after he blew his career essentially as a main eventer by being, a pothead and getting stuck with Sabu on the side of the highway. Yeah, so he's basically in that role. Except Rob Van Dam had charisma and Matt Riddle doesn't. Matt Riddle, unfortunately, does not have the charisma and doesn't have the freedom that Rob Van Dam did. So he's basically just a guy who walks around and says bro. And because Randy Orton is not doing anything because he's done with the Fiend, they just slotted Matt Riddle in there. But Matt Riddle's a good example of why the Fiend and people like Alexa Bliss don't work, because he's example of this is a character who requires nuance, and WWE cannot do nuance because it slots everybody into roles. And characters like Alexa Bliss and the Fiend are basically undergoing the same treatment as somebody like Matt Riddle, where whatever the details, whatever the lore of their character was, it's just being sanded down till there's nothing left. And there's nothing really left for the Fiend. There's nothing left for him. If he doesn't reinvent himself, I mean, he might reinvent himself. Again, as I said, he's either got the devil's luck or a monkey's paw or something. Because honestly, I would have expected Bray Wyatt to be out of the company years ago. I would have expected him to be released because they just don't know what to do with the guy. They just keep putting him in matches and they just don't know what to do with the guy. But I guess he keeps creating ideas that Vince likes because they keep putting him on television. And I guess Bray Wyatt has an infinite capacity for humiliation and seeing whatever he creates be ground into dust. But anyway, so the Fiend's still not going to work. The Fiend's never going to work. I hate to say it. I hate to say that because, you want creativity to succeed, but WWE is not a company where creativity succeeds. WWE is a company where you need to fit a role and you take your marching orders. And if you do that and you fit the role, you're going to have a long, prosperous career, which is why someone like Jinder Mahal still has a career and still has a job in WWE and is still being pushed like a big thing in WWE, despite the fact he's been humiliated dozens of times. Because that's all that matters in WWE, is that you take your marching orders and you do what's expected of you. If you're being creative, you can expect to be out the door. You can expect to be like the Revival and be fired and be removed out the door. You can expect to be like the Iconics and be, unsurprisingly and summarily removed. But yeah, the Fiend, 6 months ago, I called all this shit on the Fiend and said that character's got no future. And the character had no future, still has no future. And it's sad to say that, but it's true. And the sooner that the Fiend goes away or comes up with something new, the sooner that a performer like Alexa Bliss, who is capable of so much more, can dig herself out of the crap that she's now stuck in because of the Fiend. And honestly, I just wish Bray Wyatt would come with a character that fits a wrestling persona. Like, I seriously wish he would stop, like, trying to be Duke the Dumpster Draws, you know? Like, I seriously wish he would just make a character who's a wrestler who wrestles for once, because he would probably find a lot more opportunities, you know? And I know that sounds weird because he's had a championship match, but he's held championships, but all that really amounted to was, you know, all that happened when he had the championship was he got fed to Goldberg because they didn't want to feed Reigns to him. Or was it Reigns? I don't remember. They didn't want to feed somebody to Goldberg, and so they put it on the Fiend so that he could be fed to Goldberg in like 13 seconds. That's how not much of a non-entity it was. And the other time is they thought that they could make a mint on Fiend belts, which were hideous, and remind me of Jeff Hardy's belts in TNA. And there's one thing you don't want to model yourself after. It's Jeff Hardy in TNA. You really don't want to do that. You really don't want to model yourself on creatively burnt out and out of his mind Jeff Hardy, you know, as your creative lodestar, or, you know, you don't want to do that. You don't want to do that. And the Fiend is like all of that. So yeah, it's really sad. It's just really sad to watch performers like Bray Wyatt, who's so creative and can, like, clearly commits to the bits, and someone like Alexa Bliss, who is capable of so much more, be sucked into all this crap. Because it's just not going to work. It's never going to work. The best he can hope for is to end up like the Boogeyman, where they trot him out every once in a while, you know, for a pop, to humiliate somebody like King Booker, who's not being taken seriously. And, like, you know, or maybe he can be trotted out to, like, you know, get thrown out of the Royal Rumble in like 10 seconds. You know, that's maybe where he's at right now. If he can reinvent himself, that'd be great. But right now, there's a reason why he's not on television, because they got nothing for him. Like, there's nothing left. He's fought Randy Orton a bunch. There's no other character they can slot him in against that fits the monster versus monster thing. And so he's either going to end up a comedy character, or he's going to end up, like, honestly, the saddest thing I can imagine him ending up is ending up like the Mastodon. Like, seriously, ending up like Vader when he was in WWE, and he, like, lost a match and took off his thing, you know, took off his mask, I guess. It wasn't really a mask, because it didn't really cover much. You know, took off his head thing, you know, his helmet, and he's like, maybe Vader time is over. I'm just a fat piece of shit. Like, that's basically where the Fiend, like, that's where Bray Wyatt's headed right now. That's the trajectory Bray Wyatt's on if nothing changes. Nothing changes, he's going to end up, you know, doing that same thing. He's going to end up being like, you know, maybe it's all a lie. Maybe I'm a fat piece of shit, and that's it. I mean, you could say the same thing about guys like Keith Lee. You know, Keith Lee doesn't fit a mold. He's not on television anymore. You know, he's a big guy. He doesn't work like a big guy, so he's not on television. He gets sent back to NXT so he can, you know, fit the mold. Because if you don't fit a mold, you don't belong in WWE. And, yeah, so the Fiend's kind of terrible. Fiend still sucks. And he's never going to stop sucking, because WWE will never let him stop sucking. And even if they let him stop sucking, I'm not sure he would anyway. Because supernatural characters don't work, as I said in the last video. But that's your 6-month update. I really hope in 6 months he's not still around. That's what I honestly hope. I hope in 6 months from now I'm not making another video in December or November like, okay, the Fiend's back and he's terrible still. I really hope that's not the case. So, see you in 6 months, I guess.